You were once a Special Forces king, unexpectedly. You transmigrated to primitive society, becoming a little savage of only 10 years old. At this moment, you led several warriors from the Han tribe, sneaking into the cannibal tribe's camp under the cover of night. You carefully counted the number of captives in the enemy camp. There were clearly 60 or 70 people when you saw them this morning, but now there were only 50 or so left. Just as you were secretly wondering, a muffled groan suddenly came from the side, followed by a burst of violent struggling. Turning your head, you saw Blood Hand covering the guide's mouth, forcefully pressing him to the ground. The guide's eyes were wide with anger, tears welling up as he stared fixedly at a totem warrior on guard duty. The totem warrior was holding a roasted, strip-shaped object in his hand, munching on it with relish, making smacking sounds. Upon closer inspection, the top of the strip-shaped object in his hand was unmistakably 5 human fingers. He was gnawing on a human arm, suppressing the nausea and rage in your heart. You turned and glared fiercely at the guy, weighing, signaling him not to act rashly. After reconnoitering the enemy's specific defense arrangements, the three of you quietly crawled back the way you came. Immediately afterwards, you began to gather the tribesmen and allocate tasks in an orderly manner. You selected 50 archers with precise archery skills, ordering them to concentrate their fire on the dozen or so sentries in a moment, requiring them to kill all of them instantly without making too much noise, so as not to wake the enemies sleeping on the ground. Another 50 strong warriors were sent out to quietly sneak into the enemy's camp after the sentries were eliminated, stealing the spears propped on the ground, leaving them without long-range weapons. The remaining 300 or so people were ambushed around the area, waiting for the completion of the previous tasks before swarming up and using the 30 large nets to trap the enemies firmly. Warriors without nets could only go in directly and take action, the first target being to seize the stone axes in the enemy's hands, completely depriving them of the weapons they used to resist. Then the rest would be much easier to handle, simply a hand-to-hand brawl. After all, the number of warriors on the Han tribe's side was nearly twice that of the enemy, and they also held weapons in their hands. Controlling the situation should not be difficult. This meticulous reconnaissance, coupled with the deployment of combat missions after returning, quietly brought the time to around 2 a.m. The main force picked up their equipment and began a tense and exciting night raid. Everyone still, like last time, waited until they ran to a distance of about 200 meters before beginning to crawl forward. The archers crawled at the very front, this time. Everyone crawled even slower and more cautiously, because with so many people, even a small sound could easily be detected if it became concentrated. After crawling for more than 20 minutes, hundreds of mud-covered warriors finally reached the forward position, within 40 meters of each other, but everyone dared not get too close. Only the archers were relatively forward, about 20 meters away. The archers were all equipped with longbows, unable to fire while lying on the ground like crossbows, so they could only wait for your order. Then everyone would stand up together and launch an attack. After another minute or two, the enemy's sentries still had no idea, and those who were sleeping showed no signs of movement. When the opportunity arrived, you immediately issued the order to attack. You imitated the call of a cuckoo, making to clear bird calls. The enemies on guard duty were all stunned when they heard this unfamiliar sound, secretly wondering what kind of bird it was, as they had never heard a call like that before. However, they didn't have a chance to identify carefully. The moment they heard the call, 50 mud-covered people suddenly stood up like ghosts from the grass around the dozen or so sentries. They gripped longbows, also covered in mud, tightly in their hands. Arrows were already steadily knocked on the strings. The next second, a rain of arrows streaked through the night sky with a whooshing sound. This was followed by a series of muffled thoughts, the sound of arrows hitting their targets. The dozen or so enemies instantly fell to the ground, each with 3 or 4 arrows stuck in their bodies, all hitting vital spots. Seeing that all the sentries had been eliminated, you immediately stood up and waved your arm vigorously towards the enemy camp. 50 warriors quickly set out, running in a crouch to the enemy's camp, nimbly picking up the spears propped on the ground and running out. Then throwing them behind them, the remaining warriors immediately rushed up like a tide. But the scene was very quiet for a while, with no one shouting or killing. Everyone went up and directly covered the enemies with large nets, specifically targeting places with many people, such as those where 5 or 6 people were gathered. If there were only 3 or 4 people, they would be left to the warriors without nets to deal with. When the first large net came down, the enemies finally woke up from their dreams. However, the moment they opened their eyes, their bodies were already covered by the net. Then a group of mud-covered warriors kicked and stomped on them, beating them and causing them to scream incessantly. They couldn't break free from the nets at all, and they couldn't swing the stone axes in their hands. The remaining 60 or 70 enemies who were not covered by the nets got up one after another to resist. They instinctively wanted to grab their spears. However, when they turned their heads, they saw that the spears had long since disappeared without a trace. Helplessly, They could only use the stone axes in their hands to fight reluctantly. However, the enemies surrounding them were all holding long weapons. The totem warriors holding stone axes couldn't attack the Han tribe at all. They didn't dare to throw the stone axes away, because once they threw them away, they would have nothing left in their hands, and then there would only be a dead end. So, in some small positions, a stalemate temporarily appeared. Some enemies got up as soon as they heard the movement. Seeing so many enemies suddenly appearing around them, they suddenly had the intention of retreating. And they began to flee for their lives without even fighting. But before they could run far, they were accurately pulled back by those enemies using meteor hammers. There were also some who were more warlike, 5 or 6 people gathered together, fighting to the death with the enemy with stone axes. However, they were soon ruthlessly stabbed to death by a circle of Han tribe warriors. Some enemies threw the stone axes in their hands at the first opportunity. Although they caused some casualties to the Han tribe, they were immediately pounced on by enemies several times their number and beaten non-stop. In this battle, the most outstanding performer was the assassin, Bloodhand. He was never accustomed to using the Han tribe's bronze spears. The weapon he held in his hand was still his original, handy long stick. This time, when he broke into the enemy ranks, he was like a fish in water. With a long stick in his hand, he charged left and right, slashing up and sweeping down, with amazing power, with one stick. The enemy was knocked to the ground on the spot. However, he acted with great discretion, only knocking them unconscious. This melee did not last too long. The enemies were quickly suppressed, and then they were held on the ground and beaten hard. After they were all controlled, the tribesmen immediately found ropes and began to bind the prisoners. You had people bring back all the spears that had just been seized. Cut off the spearheads with the axe you carried with you, leaving only a bare pole. Then, the remaining long wooden sticks were placed horizontally behind the prisoners, and their 2 arms were wrapped around the wooden sticks. In the middle, they had to be wrapped around the neck, and finally bound into a human-shaped cross. This way, they would not be able to untie the ropes themselves, and they would also strangle their own necks if they struggled slightly. After about 20 minutes, the prisoners were all firmly tied up, and then they were laid on the ground. They couldn't get up at all by themselves, and could only lie on the ground and shout non-stop. However, as soon as they made trouble, they would be beaten hard, and slowly no prisoners dared to make trouble again. Finally, after statistics, a total of 237 enemies were shot to death, 29 were stabbed to death, and 208 were captured alive. This would be the first batch of slaves of the Han tribe, and they were for life. They would never have the opportunity to join the Han tribe. But not a single warrior of the Han tribe was killed in this battle, and only 5 or 6 were slightly injured. There were also 57 rescued prisoners, who were tribesmen of the 2 tribes that had been attacked before. After listening to the narration of their own tribesmen, they all readily agreed to join the Han tribe. After all, with their own strength, they could not protect their own safety at all. After this battle, the power of the Han tribe was further strengthened. However, you believed in your heart that the biggest gain from this northern expedition was not only the expansion of manpower and territory, but that the Han tribe had successfully defeated a cannibal tribe for the first time through experimental combat, finding extremely effective tactical strategies for possible large-scale conflicts in the future. This was of great strategic significance for the long-term development of the tribe. Moreover, the 2 consecutive victories achieved in one day were truly like a shot in the arm, greatly boosting the morale of the tribe from top to bottom. In these 2 battles, the exquisite tactics arranged by you as the leader enabled the tribesmen to suffer almost no major casualties. This undoubtedly made your prestige in the hearts of the warriors as high as the sun in the sky. Of course, there was also an important harvest that you always kept in mind, and that was the lacquer grass of the 7 tribes, a magical plant that could produce natural lacquer, which had immeasurable potential value for the construction and development of the tribe. You had to find a way to bring this back as well. The warriors rested in place for most of the night. After it was completely bright, you called Mouse. You asked him to lead the main force back to the tribe first, making sure to keep a close eye on the captives along the way. Do not provide them with food for the time being. Only give them some salt water to drink. Starve them for a few days so they don't have extra strength to resist. After returning to the tribe, only give them 1 meal a day, just enough to keep them from starving to death. Don't relax your supervision of them for the time being. Everything will be arranged further after you return. Chief, aren't you going back with us? Mouse asked you with a puzzled look. I'm going to lead some people to the 7 tribes. They have a special plant there that is extremely useful to our tribe. I have to try my best to get some back, and see if it can be successfully planted in the tribe. Also, you must take the others back. I only need 5 cavalrymen, plus a guide is enough. We won't delay for too long. Maybe I'll catch up with you before you walk back to the tribe. All right, Chief, be careful on the road. I will take good care of those slaves. Mouse got up and solemnly bid farewell to you. You also nodded slightly, then called up 5 cavalrymen, rode your beloved Huishan, and the guide rode Meatbun. The 7 of you continued to gallop north. Soon, You arrived at the former residence of the 7 tribes, which was an extremely flat and open area, sparsely distributed with some forests and shrubs. There were also clear footprints left by many animals on the ground. At a glance, you knew that this was a good place with extremely rich resources. There was a large amount of firewood that could be used as fuel. And there were all kinds of animals that could provide people with a sufficient food source. The terrain was flat and open. The only shortcoming was that the safety was slightly worse, but if a city could be built here, it would be a good choice. The residences of the 7 tribes were all unique semi-underground dome-shaped earthen houses. If you didn't walk up to them and look closely, it would be difficult to find the existence of these houses at all. The lacquer grass that the guide mentioned grew in the bushes. It was a plant that was somewhat similar in appearance to a sunflower, with a fresh green color throughout. It was about 1.5 meters tall, and a palm-sized flower disc grew on top. However, compared with sunflowers, there were still obvious differences. The center of its flower disc was covered with many closed small holes, which contained its seeds, roughly estimated. There were about 200 seeds. The size of the seeds was similar to that of soybeans. From the appearance, it was somewhat similar to a lotus pod. The lacquer grass had a straight main stem, about 2 centimeters in diameter, slightly thicker than a human finger. It was covered with a layer of fine fluff. In fact, these fluffs were short thorns, which were very thorny. When you touched it for the first time, you were accidentally pricked, and your finger quickly swelled up after being pricked. This was not because it was poisonous, but because humans would have an allergic reaction to the lacquer-like colloid it secreted. The guide of the 7 tribes told them that after a long period of contact, the people of the tribe would not have such a situation. This made you feel quite helpless. It seemed that the tribesmen would have to endure a lot of pain when collecting lacquer in the future. The main stem of the lacquer grass also grew many oval large leaves, which were dark green in color. Each one was about a foot long. The back of the leaves was covered with a layer of toad skin-like bumps, and the bumps contained precious raw lacquer. You curiously used your bird-beak dagger to gently cut a slit in the main stem. Instantly, some viscous white colloid slowly flowed out. The flow rate was relatively slow, however. A lot could eventually be collected. The lacquer production of 1 lacquer grass was about 300 grams, which was quite considerable. But there was even more exciting news. The guide introduced you with an excited face. After collecting the branches and leaves of the lacquer grass like this, it can restore its original reserves in just 7 days. When can we start collecting each year? And how many times can we collect like this? Your eyes sparkled with surprise, and you couldn't wait to ask. It can be collected after it blooms, as long as you see the bumps on the back of the leaves bulging. It means it can be collected. Lacquer grass blooms in early summer and can continue to bloom for 2 months. As long as it is in its flowering period, it can continue to produce this precious branches and leaves. At the end of summer, the flowers will gradually wither, and then after about a month or so, its seeds will mature. At that time, the closed small holes on the flower disc will automatically open. The seeds will pop out by themselves, and then fall into the soil, and new lacquer grass will grow quickly. It can mature again in autumn. Its seeds can also be eaten, but the taste is a bit strange. Our tribesmen basically don't eat that thing, but there are many large birds and small beasts of the rodent class that are very fond of it. We often use its seeds to set traps in winter, and we can often catch some prey. The guide described the characteristics of lacquer grass to you in detail. You were overjoyed. It can mature twice a year. So there are 4 months of flowering period. In total, it can produce about 300 grams of lacquer leaves in 7 days. So there are 120 days in a year's to seasons that can produce lacquer. It can be collected 17 times, calculated this way. 2 seasons can produce about 5 kilograms of lacquer. This is just the yield of 2 lacquer grass plants. It is simply heavenly fine. What is even more heavenly fine is that its seeds can actually be eaten, although the taste is not good. But it can be used to feed poultry and livestock. After all, feed is also an indispensable resource. The tribe raises red-tailed black chickens. Wouldn't it be perfect to feed them with this seed? When the seeds are converted into muscle, they will eventually enter people's stomachs. By the way, do you still have lacquer grass seeds now? You asked expectantly. Yes, but the quantity is not much. It's in those earthen houses. I don't know if it has been destroyed. I'll go find it. After the guide finished speaking, he hurried to the earthen houses to look for seeds. The tribe had been invaded by cannibals before, and some earthen houses had collapsed, so you quickly asked people to help excavate. Under the guidance and careful identification of the guide, everyone worked together. Finally, a lot of black spherical seeds were found, which looked like black soybeans. After some effort, they were finally gathered together, weighing about 50 or 60 kilograms. When these seeds were collected, the sky had gradually reached dusk. Seeing that it was late, you decided to spend the night here. So the group began to get busy again, collecting firewood everywhere. And some people went hunting in the vicinity with bows and arrows. Before long, they caught a few wild chickens and rabbits. In this way, there was a sufficient guarantee for the food for 2 days. When it came time to eat dinner, You took out white salt and began to sprinkle it on the food, as usual. At this time, the guide saw the white salt and suddenly told you that he had seen this thing before. This made you feel very surprised. And you secretly wondered if there were any salt mines nearby. Where have you seen it? If you go in the direction where the sun rises for 5 days from here, you have to swim across a river in the middle. There is a salt lake on the opposite bank. There is this thing on the stones by the lake, but that white salt is not as white as yours. And its lake water is also salty. The guide described a salt lake in detail. There are such things nearby. What's the name of the salt lake you mentioned?